Hi, boys and girls. My name is Vicki Louise Thomas, but you may call me Aunt Vicki. I live on the Tennessee River, and did you know that the Tennessee River is one of the very few rivers in the whole world that runs south and north? And I live in a small cottage on the bank of the river, and it's surrounded by a lot of woods. I am a writer. I write short stories and poems for children all over the world. My stories are about Cuddles and Spuddles. Now we're about to find out who they are in just a moment. But first, a poem about a greedy little child who got a tummy ache for being selfish. This is Aunt Vicki's magical hat box. And on top sits Aunt Vicki's magical teapot. And here inside is where I keep all of the stories and the poems that I write for all the boys and girls. Our poem is titled 5 Apples. I picked an apple from a tree. I picked an apple just for me. How shiny and red it did look, so a big bite from it I took. How juicy and sweet it tasted to me, never a better apple could there be. I picked an apple from a tree. I picked an apple just for me. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 apples ever so quickly I did pick and eat, but the 5th apple was not such a good treat. It tasted sour and bitter, making my belly rumble. As I swallowed down the last bite, over I fell with a tumble. I picked an apple from a tree. I picked an apple just for me. Up on the ground I lay with my tummy ache. Another apple from the tree I dared not to take. Ouch! Never again greedy shall I be. To share is better, 'tis plain now to see. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 apples I picked from a tree, but only 1 apple was just for me. So boys and girls, always remember, it's much, much better to share, okay? The Adventures of Cuddles and Spuddles. One day, late in November, Mr. and Mrs. Leafy went into town to do some shopping. Mrs. Leafy needed to buy groceries so that she could cook her usual delicious Thanksgiving dinner. Mr. Leafy needed to buy a new hammer and some nails to fix his barn roof, so they decided to stop at the grocery store first, and on the road back home they could stop at the hardware store. The grocery store was a huge store filled with all the wonderful things that Mrs. Leafy would need to make a Thanksgiving meal. Mr. and Mrs. Leafy slowly began filling up their shopping cart with all kinds of good things to make and bake. Mrs. Leafy said thoughtfully to herself, "We are going to have a very fine meal this holiday," and Mr. Leafy picked out the largest turkey in the whole store. Without realizing it, they had been in the store for well over an hour, so quickly they rushed to the checkout stand with a cart full of groceries. A young lady stood at the register and thanked them kindly for shopping at the store. As Mr. and Mrs. Leafy loaded all the grocery bags into the back of their brand new pickup truck, they began laughing at themselves. They had bought so many things. Mr. Leafy started the truck and drove safely to the hardware store that sat on the corner at the end of the street. It was a small store, but the Leafys enjoyed shopping there because the owner was their friend. His name was Mr. Rivers, and he had a cat named Maudie. Maudie was a big cat, and her fur was a fluffy light gray color. Her big round eyes were the color of golden daffodils. Maudie helped Mr. Rivers welcome his customers happily into the store. As Mr. and Mrs. Leafy opened the door of the hardware store, a bell softly rang to tell Mr. Rivers and Maudie that customers had just came in. Mr. Rivers looked out from behind his counter and saw his good friends, the Leafys. "Greetings," called Mr. Rivers from behind his counter. "Please come in, my friends," he said joyfully. Mr. Leafy shook hands with Mr. Rivers, and they patted each other on the back. They were happy to see each other and always enjoyed talking about the grand and great adventures they had together when they were young boys. As they began talking, Mrs. Leafy noticed that something seemed different in the store. But what was it, she wondered. Suddenly, she knew exactly what it was. Maudie the cat was nowhere to be seen. Now, Mrs. Leafy did not wish to be rude and interrupt Mr. Leafy and Mr. Rivers while they were talking, but she was very concerned about Maudie. "Please excuse me," said Mrs. Leafy in a rather worried-sounding voice, "but where is Maudie?" Mr. Rivers walked behind his counter and asked Mrs. Leafy to follow him. Much to Mrs. Leafy's relief, there lay Maudie on a soft pillow that was tucked down neatly inside a cardboard box. There, nestled beside Maudie, was two beautiful twin kittens. By this time, Mr. Leafy had came behind the counter to see what they were looking at. The Leafys loved animals and thought the new kittens were just wonderful. However, Mr. Rivers began to sadly shake his head as he explained to the Leafys that he and Maudie could not keep the kittens. The store was small and contained lots of dangerous tools and equipment. There was no room for the kittens to run and play. "Small kittens are like small children," said Mr. Rivers. "They need a home that is safe and full of love to grow up in." "That is very true," said Mr. and Mrs. Leafy. "Kittens and children both need to be cared for, and raising them was a very big responsibility." "Well," said Mr. Rivers, "I have tried to find them a good home, but nobody seems to want them both." Mr. Rivers did not want to separate the kittens because they were twins, and he felt that the kittens needed to stay together. Thought Mr. Leafy, it would be nice to have kittens on the farm. But suddenly he remembered why he had came into the store. "I need a new hammer and a sack full of nails to fix my barn roof," he said to Mr. Rivers. Together, Mr. Leafy and Mr. Rivers walked about the store, gathering the things that was needed for Mr. Leafy. And he also bought a few extra things to mend his barnyard fence. As Mr. Rivers rang up all the items, he asked Mr. Leafy if there was anything else he needed. "Yes," said Mr. Leafy, "I do need just 2 more small items." Mrs. Leafy and Mr. Rivers began laughing as Mr. Leafy explained that he would like to have a pair of good young kittens. "I need them to chase the mice out of my hayloft," explained Mr. Leafy. The Leafys owned a beautiful farm in the hills just outside of town, and it was a perfect place to raise kittens. Mr. Rivers lifted the small animals and gave them to Mrs. Leafy. He sighed with relief, knowing the kittens had now found a very good home. "This is Cuddles, and this one is Spuddles," he said to Mrs. Leafy. Cuddles was the color of a harvest orange pumpkin pie and had big, beautiful blue eyes that sparkled like stars in the night sky. Spuddles looked exactly the same as Cuddles. There was, however, a big difference in them, and it made it easy to tell them apart. The difference was that Cuddles was a girl and Spuddles was a boy. Both kittens were bouncy and curious as all small animals are. No doubt Cuddles and Spuddles would enjoy exploring the Leafy's farm. They both snuggled gently against Mrs. Leafy's soft, rosy cheeks as she held them closely in her arms. But suddenly, Maudie leapt out of her box and began meowing quite loudly. Mr. Rivers saw that Maudie felt upset and very confused. Maudie could not understand what on earth was going on, and she wondered why Mrs. Leafy was holding her kittens. Mr. Rivers kindly picked up Maudie to comfort her, and in a soft voice he tried to explain that Cuddles and Spuddles were going to live on the farm with Mr. and Mrs. Leafy. Maudie began to slowly settle down and seemed to understand exactly what Mr. Rivers had said to her. After all, Maudie was a very, very smart cat, and she knew all about the Leafys farm. Every holiday, the Leafys invited Mr. Rivers and Maudie out to their place to enjoy the fresh country air and to also enjoy Mrs. Leafy's scrumptious holiday meals. The farm was Maudie's favorite place to visit, and her best friend Cap lived there. Cap was Mr. and Mrs. Leafy's big black and white sheepdog. Cap's real name was Captain, but everyone just called him Cap for short. Mr. Rivers put Maudie lightly onto the floor, and she went to nestle back down on her soft pillow. Maudie knew everything would be just fine, and she drifted back off to sleep, thinking about the hayloft in the big barn where she and Cap loved to roam about. Mr. Rivers waved goodnight to the Leafys and thanked them for shopping at his hardware store. He also thanked them for inviting him and Maudie to spend Thanksgiving Day with them. The wind was now blowing hard, and the weather was getting much colder as Mr. and Mrs. Leafy drove away toward home. Cap the sheepdog was lying on the narrow dirt road that ran along the side of the Leafys' two-story house. He had been laying there for most of the day. Every now and then, however, he would get up and go check on all the farm animals. Cap always felt it was his job to watch over the place and follow Mr. and Mrs. Leafy about as they did their daily farm chores. Cap didn't like being left behind when his owners went into town, but like all good farm dogs, Cap knew the animals needed watching after, and he was the kind of dog who always did his job well. Patiently, Cap lay listening and watching for the Leafys to come home and kept a watchful eye over the whole farm. He was looking toward the sky now and could see the sun setting behind the hillside. He was beginning to grow rather anxious when suddenly he heard a noise out on the gravel road. He quickly jumped up and ran toward the driveway in front of the farmhouse. He could see someone was coming, and he eagerly began wagging his long shaggy tail and smiling. It was Mr. and Mrs. Leafy. After a long day of waiting, Cap was happy to see them. Mr. Leafy patted Cap on the head and asked how things went around the old home place today. Cap felt contented by Mr. Leafy's gentle pat on the head and began watching Mr. Leafy carry sacks of food into the bright yellow kitchen that always smelled like fresh baked bread. Cap sniffed the air and could smell all sorts of delicious things to eat. He sniffed again, and how he could smell the freshness of Mr. Leafy's new truck. He also got a sniff of Mrs. Leafy's sweet perfume. But as he began to sniff once more, he could detect a strange scent in which he was not familiar with. So Cap began trying to find out where this strange smell was coming from. But now Mrs. Leafy began calling him. Cap quickly ran to Mrs. Leafy to see what was going on. There stood Mrs. Leafy holding Cuddles and Spuddles. Cap soon realized this was a strange odor he had been smelling. He began running in circles and barking furiously. Then he began howling and howling, oh, ever so loudly. Mr. Leafy rushed out of the kitchen to see what was happening. Mr. Leafy could see that Cap was very upset. "Here, Cap, old boy," called Mr. Leafy in a stern voice. "Whatever is the matter with you, Cap?" he asked. Then Mr. Leafy saw Cuddles and Spuddles and understood what the problem was. The dog was very upset at seeing the kittens. Mr. Leafy gently began calming Cap down by patting him on the head and talking to him. "Now then," Mr. Leafy said to Cap, "your new friends will not think they are welcome here in their new home if you're mean like that." Cap could not believe his ears. "Surely," thought Cap to himself, "I'm not supposed to put up with those two strange-looking creatures living here." But as Mrs. Leafy took the kittens inside, Cap knew it was true. "Yep," he thought to himself, "that is exactly what is going to happen. These two strange-looking creatures are now living in the very same house with me, and to say the least, poor Cap was not at all pleased." Once more, Mrs. Leafy tried to introduce Cuddles and Spuddles to Cap. "This is your best friend's kittens," she told him. "Remember Maudie the cat that comes to play and to visit with you on all the wonderful holidays?" These are her kittens, and now we are going to take care of them for Maudie and Mr. Rivers." Now at the sound of Maudie's name, Cap's ears stood straight up. Maudie was his dearest and best friend in the world, and just the thought of her made Cap feel happy. "Well," thought Cap, "I guess I can put up with these two to help out my good friends Maudie and Mr. Rivers." In the sitting area, a warm fire was now glowing in the fireplace. In front of the fireplace was a huge, thick, round rug where Cap always enjoyed sleeping. Cap spent a lot of nights just lying there looking out through the large bay window that faced out over the farmyard. He enjoyed looking at the big full moon in the dark night sky and seeing stars twinkling through soft white clouds. The household had now gathered in the cozy sitting area. They were feeling full and contented. Mrs. Leafy had fixed supper for everyone, and Mr. Leafy and Cap had already fed all the farm animals. Cap helped Mr. Leafy to make sure all the animals were now safe and inside the barn and safely bedded down for the long, frosty, cold night. Mr. Leafy had made Cuddles and Spuddles a bed out of a wooden crate. He placed the crate on the huge thick round rug in front of the fireplace. Inside the crate, Mrs. Leafy had placed in one of her beautiful homemade quilts that she herself had made. Then gently she placed Cuddles and Spuddles on top of the soft, colorful quilt. Cuddles and Spuddles were very delighted with their new bed, but Cap thought the kittens were too close to his favorite sleeping place. So he lay down on the big rug with a gentle growl toward Cuddles and Spuddles, just to let them know he wanted nothing at all to do with them. Mr. and Mrs. Leafy rocked back and forth in their rocking chairs, which made a slow, soft, squeaking sound. The reading lamp that sat on the table between the rocking chairs glowed gently. The fire in the fireplace cast dancing shadows on the dimly lit room, and ever so often the fire popped and crackled gently. The whole family was now enjoying the peace and quiet that the night had brought to the farm. As Cuddles and Spuddles looked out over the top of their snuggly bed, they couldn't help but notice Cap. Cap had fallen asleep and was snoring softly. The kittens began to stare at Cap and could not help but become a little curious about him. After all, they had never seen a dog before. They noticed that Cap had a long, shaggy tail, and ever so often Cap would swish it back and forth as he slept. Cuddles and Spuddles decided that this was something they wanted to take a closer look at. Mr. and Mrs. Leafy was now napping in their rocking chairs and were unaware of the kitten's intentions. Cuddles climbed up on top of the wooden crate and tumbled out onto the round rug. Spuddles eagerly followed after Cuddles. Now they both began to tiptoe quietly toward Cap's long, shaggy tail. Cuddles wanted to touch Cap's tail, so slowly she began to lift her front paw. But much to Cuddles' surprise, Cap's tail suddenly swished again and sent Cuddles flying into the air. Cuddles was so frightened that she let out a loud hissing noise as she landed right on top of poor Cap's head. Cap jumped up quickly out of his sound sleep and began barking wildly. By now the Leafys were both jumping out of their rocking chairs in bewilderment. "What is going on?" cried out Mrs. Leafy to Mr. Leafy. Cap was beside himself, and Cuddles and Spuddles were now standing in the corner of the room shaking nervously. Mr. Leafy quietened Cap back down as he tried to figure out why the animals were so upset. Mrs. Leafy put the kittens back into their beds and rubbed them gently. "Well, what on earth do you think could have gotten into them?" asked Mr. Leafy, as he scratched his head in a confused way. "I think maybe these two were investigating old Cap's tail," said Mrs. Leafy, as she pointed toward Cuddles and Spuddles. Mr. Leafy looked at Cap, who was now staring at his long, shaggy tail in a state of shock. Said Mr. Leafy. "Well, what do you know about that?" Then Mr. and Mrs. Leafy began laughing as off to bed they went. Thanksgiving Day was sure to bring a day that would be a day of many surprises for the Leafy farm. But for now, all was quiet once again as everyone slept peacefully. Boys and girls, I sincerely hope that you have enjoyed Aunt Vicky's story time. Please let me know how you like it. Give me your reviews, give me your thoughts, and please continue to check in with me as I will continuously be posting and putting on great stories about Cuddles and Spuddles and lots more adventures, and we will have a lot more poem reading too. So thank you once again. Goodbye, boys and girls.